we get going. So let me start the recording. Good to have you all here. I'm glad you could join me today. And man, what a time we're living in. As you know, those of you that joined me for the previous webinar we did on the Payroll Protection Act, glad to have everybody back now as we've kind of filtered through Easter. And I trust that Easter went well for each of your ministries. I know for us, it was obviously a little bit different doing it remotely and virtually, but man, the Lord was glorified all the same. So we really had a good time. Kind of weird not getting to meet with your extended family for that time, but we had a good time here with just me and the kid, me, my wife, and the kids. So glad to have you all here. Glad you could join us. We're going to spend a few minutes today. I'm going to try to keep things under an hour for I want to be a good steward of your time, but I do appreciate you being here. And today we're going to talk about how to optimize your church budget during this crisis. I said a crisis, which kind of relates to anything, but these are going to be some actionable tips we can take right now. I've been talking about this with my team here for the last few weeks, just knowing that this time was coming, and didn't want to do it last week. I know everybody was busy getting ready for Easter, getting everything prepared on how in the world are we going to do Easter. But now we've kind of gone past that. And like I said, I trust Easter was well for everybody, but we want to move forward and say, what does the new norm look like over the next few weeks? And so we'll talk about that today. So who am I? I am Josh Henry. I'm the founder and chief simplifier, I term myself, of Church.com. And I've been doing this side of ministry where we partner with churches to help with the business side, that admin side of church that most pastors, don't want to deal with. And oftentimes they're not qualified, nor are they called for that side of ministry. But it is an area that needs to be taken care of. So Simplified Church, for those of you that don't know, we are an outsourced bookkeeping, payroll, and online giving provider designed with your church in mind. Now, while that might sound cliche, it really is. I was a pastor prior to starting this company, and really put things together so that we can handle those sides of church that, like I said, that typically that side of church you did not get into ministry for. Let's put it that way. So our solutions are able to provide all this for you guys. I'm going to figure out what that dinging is and get that turned off so that we don't get interrupted. Let me get that closed out. So, all right, cool. So, yeah, like I said, Simplified Church, would just love to serve your church. I know a lot of you. I'm looking through the list of people that are on. I know we are serving alongside many of you in ministry, and some of the names I don't recognize. So we'd love to have that discussion about how we can partner with your church to help you take care of this business side of church that we focus and excel in. So some housekeeping things, and before we get started on the agenda, those of you that have joined us, I noticed, several have come in since we got started, so welcome. If you'd hop in the chat box and just kind of tell us where you're from, I'd appreciate that. And just some housekeeping rule, if you have a question, there's the chat box or the question and answer box within the webinar. If you hop it in there, I've got the screens open. I've got two screens open here so I can kind of track both. So if I stutter or happen to seem like I've lost my train of thought, it's because I'm trying to monitor both. So bear with me on that, but would love to be here to answer any questions you have. So what we're going to do today, we're going to, again, talk about optimizing your church budget as we are in this new reality in this season. So a couple things I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about your role in the church finances. We'll discuss that very briefly just to make sure you understand where I'm coming from on this and why the suggestions that I put forward on what you should do, why I'm putting those things forward. So secondly, we'll talk about what your finances are probably looking like during this season, and then some actionable steps that you can take right now. And then we'll also kind of talk about what's next, and then to open up some time for Q&A at the end. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, I've got a pretty quick set of slides here that we can go through. Again, I am recording this, so it will be available to you after things are going off here, but we'll talk. So first thing, what is your role? I always ask this question, and I'll put it in the chat box, and just give me yes, no, or even if I want to talk a small comment. Should a pastor know the finances of the church? Let me pose that question to you because, again, I have my own thoughts on this, and I can probably ride the fence and talk on both sides. Again, we're talking about the general finances, not necessarily, I know the debate can come into whether or not the pastor should know the giving, but this is the overall finances. We can discuss giving down the road. So yeah, absolutely, guys. I'm saying yes, absolutely. Should know but not be involved. Good point. Yeah, a lot of absolutely. So it sounds like we are on this the same page here. Yeah, Rob, you and I are two peas in a pod on that one. That's the same thing I preached. Yet your budget is your mission and vision filter through which you know. Brian, good point. Knowledgeable, yes. I think we're all kind of coming from the same background. I'm a firm believer that the pastor knows the general finances of the church. Now, is he the one writing the checks and paying the bills? Well, that's the debatable part. Obviously you want to have that check and balance, and we always tell our pastors you need to be an arm's length away. We like to have that point where the pastor's not necessarily involved in the day-to-day operations, but pastor, as the shepherd of the flock, should have some idea of the financial health of the ministry. Without knowing that, the pastor has no way to effectively lead the church. So we'll come at that. I do see a couple people disagreeing with me, and so we can talk about that. But where I'm coming from in this point is that you as pastors, as church leaders, have an idea of the finances. And it really goes into our first point here that we'll come onto as our first step as we optimize our budget for this season. Your first step is to know your numbers. One of my favorite shows is on CNBC. It's called The Prophet. And the guy that is the host, his name is Marcus Lemonis. He is the CEO of Camping World. But he takes, and what he does is he goes into struggling businesses and buys a share or helps them out, gives them some sort of partnership agreement. And then from there, he helps them revamp what they're doing. And one of the things he'll say, if you don't know your numbers, you don't know your business. I would contend a similar philosophy exists here. If you don't know your numbers, you don't know your church. Now, I'm not talking about being focused on the numbers to where you lose track of your mission and vision, or you lose track of people, you lose track of the spiritual health. But if you don't know your numbers, you don't have any measure to accurately know what's going on in your church. So what does that look like? What are those numbers that we need to be looking at, especially in this time, as we're moving into this season where we're not meeting physically and things are different? So what are those numbers we need to know? You need to know your giving trends and the amount totals. What do I mean by that? But right now, we're doing this for all of our partner churches. We are tracking. We took and looked at your 2019 overall giving and divided that by 12 to give us your average giving for the year. We then took your January and February numbers and did the average of those. And then now we have a benchmark and a basis to look at March, April, May as we go through this season. I would recommend you kind of do the same thing with your church, where you kind of have an idea, what trend were you on and what does the reality look like for you now? I'll admit, as we're seeing some of our churches right now, giving in some areas is actually up, believe it or not. Now, I hesitate to say that because I know some of you might be struggling. Some of you might have smaller churches where giving wasn't great to begin with, and now it's not gotten any better. But the reality is what we're seeing in many of our churches, I would say even above the average, giving is up during this time. Now, some of that's just been, guys, we're doing a great job of sharing the vision with people. We're doing a great job of telling people about the need and really letting them know that giving has to continue. We have an online giving system called Simplify Give. Many of you are using that. And I can say through that system, as I'm watching the trends, it is way up. It was up for March. I just finished the report looking at March's totals. We were way up to the tune of processing $110,000 more than we did in February through that system. And that's not adding any new merchants, any new churches into that system for that same period of time. So of course, people can't meet. So, even the folks that, we might be trading dollars for dollars and that they would have written a check and now they can't write the check. So they gave online. So some of that's there, but it's looking like the general giving in many instances is up. So that's really cool to see. The next thing you want to know is your general giving involvement. You need to know how many folks of your attenders are actually part, or your membership are giving. Now, I did not say you need to know their totals. I just want you to know that they're involved. Now, if you are of the mindset where the pastor shouldn't know that, have somebody that does. Have your treasurer, the chair, the leader of your finance team, whomever that is. Somebody needs to know what the involvement looks like. Pastor, I would contend for your staff, you need to know if your staff is giving. Staff, elders, deacons, key leaders, if they're not giving, then that's something that needs to be addressed. Those are the people you really need to know. I'd contend you should know everybody. But again, I can ride both sides of that argument as well. So secondly, the third thing you need to have an idea on is your giving per unit. What is that metric? What does that number look like? So basically at this point in time, because it's so difficult to track attendance, there really isn't a great way to do it right now, meeting virtually. So for many of us, we're reaching a church body that, quite frankly, some of those folks may never have stepped foot in the door of our church, but man, they're happy to hop on Facebook and watch your service on Sunday morning. So that is awesome, in that we're sharing the gospel in areas that we were never able to do before, to people we were never able to meet before. But again, it's very hard to know your numbers as far as an attendance amount. So what I would do in your giving per unit is take your total giving for the deposit. Let's just say you got $1,000 this week. And of that $1,000, that was made up of 5 people. So you or 50 people. You can kind of see where that number comes in to the dividing it out. So you'll know kind of what that benchmark dollar figure is. You want your church in a giving per unit number. Again, these numbers will probably be swayed a little bit in our current reality. You want that in that $20 to $40 range. As a healthy church, according to national leaders that are doing research on hundreds of churches and what those numbers look like. So no giving per unit. These are things that you can keep an eye on that are generic numbers that really don't, still leave you as pastor an arm's length away from knowing too many specifics if you don't want to know your individual information. So the other thing you'll want to know is, what was your actual Neil, is that per week? I would look at it on a monthly basis, just because you want to see the involvement for the month. That way you can know you transcend over giving payroll dates. So I would look at that over the whole month. Good question, though. So the other thing you want to have an eye on here is your actual versus budget expenses. You want to know where what that's looking at. What did you budget to have happen and what actually happened? Go back into 2019 and see where you're at. Go into January, go into February, look at March. For most of us, it was that middle of March that the shutdown and the shelter in place and all those things started to happen. So March will be a little bit skewy on your numbers. April's going to be the bigger tell on this, but start to see what that looks like. You might pull 2 reports in March. You might pull the 1st through the 14th, and then the 14th and after, and kind of see how that trend changed at that time. You also, finally, on those numbers, want to know your monthly gain or loss. We run a profit and loss statement, and that is a great statement. I mean, I know a lot of churches shy from me calling it that, because churches don't really want to ever talk about profit or loss for that matter. But it really is what it is. We want to know, did we spend more than we took in last month, or did we save more than we spent? We want to know that number, because then we know if we have the cash flow available. for that. So finally, another number I would suggest you keep an eye on is your top 10 donor amounts. I wouldn't even say you need to know who, if that is something that you're concerned with, but I would track your bank. If you ever go for financing, your bank is going to ask you this question: who and what are the numbers of your top 10 donors? And why would they ask you that? Well, they want to know how spread out you are. They want to look to see what is the diversity of those donors. Do you have one donor that's making up 90% of your income? If that's the case, you have a potential problem on your hand if that donor ever decides to leave. You want to make sure that your top 10 donors are not the same family. I've seen it before in that instance where, there was a church where the top 3 or 4 donors were, the adult dad, the adult sons, and they're going, and then all of a sudden one of them gets ticked off and leaves the church and the rest follow. And guess what? You just lost, 3 to 4 of your top 10 donors. That's a big hit to the church. Now, that's a whole other discussion that we don't need to get into today as far as church health, but that's something you want to know. Let's see, questions came in. Would knowing the average giving amount per giver be helpful? Yeah, I mean, I would keep an eye on that, Byron. That is not as telling a sign of church health because, everybody has kind of their own income. If you take 10% of 100,000, that's a different number than a 10% of 400,000. So yeah, the average giving per giver is a helpful number to know. But just based on a lot of the churches that I know, some of the churches just where they're located, geographically, some of your urban churches are not going to have as high a giving per donor, just because the area they're in is not a well-to-do, wealthy area. Back and forth, Byron. So hopefully that answers your question, Byron. So Brian, man, is unit a family or individual? It depends. What we're doing here, typically if you're doing it by congregation, then it is by family. It would be by tracking by your congregation. So we're not able to track that number right now. I would do it by number of people participating. So a unit is a person participating in that deposit time. So if husband and wife give separately, and you're tracking that separately, I would count that as 2. If they give separately and you lump them back together, then that would be 1. So hopefully that answers your question. Sorry that I don't have a more clear answer to that, especially since we're running it off the giving involvement, not the congregation attendance. So moving on, here is the next step I would have for you in optimizing your budget at this time. You need to analyze your critical expenses. We could talk about giving all day long, and as well as I do in church, giving is one of those things that we have very little control over. We are pretty much at the graciousness of our givers on our income. Now, one thing we do have control over is our expenses and where we're spending the money. So I would, at this time, go through your budget and analyze what are your critical expenses. Let me give you some pointers here on where you might look and where you might start with these numbers. So from analyzing our critical expenses, the first and foremost that you probably have is your payroll. That is a critical expense. That is paying for people's livelihoods. That is one of the expenses that absolutely probably needs to be one of the last things we would look to cut. Next one, and that's kind of what I'm talking about, and you're analyzing critical expenses. These are those expenses that, man, if everything starts shutting down, these are the things that we probably need to keep maintained over some others. So what else would be a critical expense? I would contend your rent or your mortgage, unless you're, for some of our church plants that meet in a rented location, this might not be a critical expense. That actually might be a blessing to you in that by not meeting, you don't have that rent expense going on right now. So maybe you're in a good location with that. But for those of you that are meeting, or maybe your landlord doesn't allow you to do it, again, the rent might be in there. So secondly, some insurance or insurances that you might have available might have to continue. If you have the building, you're going to want to keep your property insurance up. Probably you could probably talk to your insurance broker about your professional liability policies, any sexual misconduct policies. You might be able to talk to them right now about that, since you're not meeting in person. They may have something available for you there on that. I know a lot of car companies right now are talking about reducing car insurance during this time because people aren't driving as much. So I would reach out to your broker on that and just kind of ask that question. If you own your building and stuff, the utilities, for those utility companies that are still taking their payments, you need to keep those things going. Then another thing, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some pointers for you to kind of consider. Another one here, missionary or denominational support. Are you supporting a missionary on a monthly basis? Just because this happened doesn't stop their need. They're probably pretty dependent on your support, as you are from a church standpoint of others supporting you. The other one, your denominational support. Again, the whatever your denomination may be doing to help other churches in your local area or your state. And finally, benevolence. At this time, if the churches can't be benevolent, then really who can? I realize that giving is down, could be down, giving tight, expenses. There's an uncertainty right now. But that uncertainty is all across the board. And how great is it if the church can take the lead and show how to bless their community and how to bless people? So again, just some areas for you to look at. What are those critical expenses that you absolutely, these are the final expenses that you have as an organization where cutting these starts to hurt. There are some other things you could cut that doesn't really hurt. If we were meeting in person and you were having budget issues, I would start to talk about, are you buying cookies for the preschoolers? Well, do the preschoolers need cookies? Can we save some money there? You buy donuts every Sunday morning. Is that an area we could cut without much pain? Yeah, those types of things. Now, so what I'm talking about here are these expenses where once we start to cut these payments, it starts to hurt a little bit from a ministry standpoint. So moving on. The third thing, determine your goals for this season. All right. So you probably already have, as we've kind of mentioned, I'm a firm believer that your budget is the filter through which you budget to your mission and vision. That way, everything you have, someone can look at your budget and have some idea what your mission and vision is for your church. So determine your goals through this season. What do you want to do? Are you wanting to just survive? Or are you wanting to thrive? Are you wanting to come out of this? Is this an opportunity for your ministry to come out looking a little bit different than it did when you started? So what are your goals for the near-term season? Ask yourself that question. Sit down and talk with your staff about that. What do we want? What do you want things to look like for the next few weeks as we continue to work remotely, as we continue to do services in a virtual capacity? What does that look like for you? Then the discussion needs to start having this discussion now. Now, we don't know when that time is going to come, that things are going to open back up. But let's start to think through, what does our church look like after? Why would we look at that now? Why would we do that? Well, many of us were a bit shell-shocked when the whole shelter-in-place happened and we were told we can no longer meet in person. There were a lot of people that sat for that first week going, how in the world? Now we got to figure out how to do live stream. Now we got to figure out how to do service remotely. Now we got to figure out how we're going to do all this. Well, we don't want the same thing to happen going the other direction. What is this going to look like when we come back? Now, you're not going to have that answer 100% because we don't even know when that's going to be. But you can start to put those plans in place for what are you going to do to get people back in the door, so that week that it happens, when all of a sudden the governors come together and the president comes together and says, hey, let's start opening the country back up, you're already a few steps ahead in a plan to know what you wanted to do during that time. So Next thing, prepare your emergency budget. Okay, so now we're getting into putting something down on a document on paper, and we've talked about knowing our numbers, knowing our income. We talked about analyzing our critical expenses, so we kind of have the framework, and then knowing where we want to go. How do we prepare that budget? Here's what I would do. I would use Excel. Get your current budget that you have, put it on one sheet inside that Excel. I apologize for not having this to show you. I was trying to get these screens, these things together before and I wanted to be able to show you this, but I'm going to talk you through it. Get your budget, get it into Excel. If you don't already have it in Excel. Take your March actuals and put them in another column. Start to analyze that. Then on another page, go and take your critical expenses and basically make a new budget on a second page so that you can see what we're actually spending money on, and then start to budget on what should we plan to spend money on moving forward. So we're going to start with the income, the expected trend of what we're thinking income is going to look like for the next few months. Let's start there so we have an idea of what our income wants to be like. Now we're going to go back and add in our critical expenses, those things that have to be paid, or we're shutting the doors for good, not just shutting the doors because we're meeting remotely. I mean, we're shutting down the organization at that point. Let's start to really look at what those things are that we need to spend money on. Then once you're able to do the calculation to say, what are we taking in minus what are we spending money on? Now that's what you have left to use as discretionary spending. Now we can start to talk back about those extra things that we can use to do ministry better. One thing I forgot to mention is we are back on the analyze your critical expenses slides. I didn't get into what are the non-critical expenses and what can we do with those during this time. Your subscriptions, you know as well as I do, it's very easy to get yourself monthly subscription to death. $9.95 here, $9.97 a month for this, $14.97 for that, $29.99 for this service or whatever we're using online. It's real easy to spend a few $100s in monthly subscriptions before you know it, because they caught you in the $10 to $15 to $20 a month here and there. So maybe look at those. Are there any of those services that maybe while we're not meeting in person, we don't need? Take a look at those. Maybe those will help you pay for Zoom or some of the other things you do need to actually facilitate your church in a remote fashion. So, back on preparing your emergency budget, determine what's remaining. Then you can kind of start to fill in the gaps. If you've been to my budget course, and I'll talk about the budget course here in a little bit. If you've been through my budget course that we have online, we talk about, it's something I took off the Franklin Covey Big Rocks from a time management perspective, but I think it's great here. Great in how you build your budget. And in this, I'm going to try to talk about it. This just popped in my mind, so I don't even have a slide prepared for it, but let me try to get through it real quick. You have one bucket, or you have a jar. The jar represents the whole of what you have. In Franklin Covey, they talk about it from a time perspective. What we'll talk about here is that jar is your total amount of money you have on a monthly basis to use. And in that jar, they have a series of big rocks and a series of little rocks. Well, if you go in and you fill that jar and start filling it with your little rocks before you've put all your big rocks into that jar, you're going to run out of space and you're not going to be able to have room for all your big rocks. But if you take a step back, empty everything out, put all the big rocks into that jar, I would contend those big rocks are your critical expenses. Once you put all those back in the jar, then as you start to fill back in, this is the discretionary side of things. As you start to fill back in those little rocks, the little rocks kind of move into the cracks and crevices of that jar and work themselves around the big rocks in that. So you end up being able to fit everything inside of there that you wanted to. Now, where that doesn't fit here is that we may be down. If you are, then you may have to start cutting into some of those little rocks. But just an idea for you to start with the big stuff that needs to be funded first and then move everything else around from there. Okay, sorry if I belabored that point. We'll move on. The next thing you need to do once we've kind of put this emergency budget in place, you need to make sure you're communicating the reality. I know many of you are doing a great job right now of staying in contact with your church. I know some of you that are hopping on Facebook on a daily basis to keep people engaged, to keep people in the loop, to keep people in the know. I would contend this is a time as well where you can start to let people know what is the reality of where the church is at. Now, am I saying you need to go and share the nitty-gritty details of your budget intricacies? No, absolutely not. But what I am saying is you can tell people and communicate the reality and say, hey, we're doing a great job. During this time, we were concerned giving might be down, but you guys have been faithful and blessed. And here's what giving has looked like over the last few weeks. We've actually been able to maintain our current giving, and we've been able to do X, Y, Z in ministry. You give tangible results to people on what their giving is doing. On the flip side of that, if the reality is, hey, guys, giving was down, and just so you know, our total payroll amount is $10,000 for the month. All giving combined, we made 15. We just barely covered, we just barely were able to cover all of our expenses after payroll. People need to know some of those realities for you. As the leader, you need to lead that conversation. You guys all know this. You guys are all leaders. You need to have that guidance. And with lack of guidance, people will come to their own conclusion, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. So if you're not telling the story, if you're not putting out the truth, if you're not putting out the facts, more than likely people are going to assume the worst. And people are going to assume that whatever they heard on TV or whatever they thought, and that, the country's shutting down, all businesses are going to close, and that includes churches too. I mean, they might assume that. So your guidance will give people the truth about what's happening. And like I said, engagement is key. You guys are doing, many of you I know, because I've seen it in my Facebook feed. I'm friends with some of you guys. Man, you're killing it as far as maintaining that communication. But I would add to that the reality of the finances as well. Share where things are at currently. Use this as your opportunity to re-emphasize the mission and vision of the church. I do a lot of talking about encouraging generosity, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Let's just go ahead and go there now. Our next step from this our final step is to encourage generosity. What does that look like? Well, I'm a huge believer that as pastors, as church leaders, we need to talk about giving. We need to talk about generosity. Now, I'm not saying that we need to talk about this and that health and wealth, prosperity. No, absolutely not. But we need to talk about generosity and what that does for people as a piece of their spiritual development. What does generosity look like? Well, how do we encourage generosity? Well, we make it not taboo. Don't just preach about it one Sunday a year and make it awkward for everybody. You need to make talking about generosity part of the DNA of your church. What does that look like? Well, regularly tell people, regularly thank people, regularly show people what their giving is doing for the ministry. When you send out donor statements, consider sending them out quarterly. And just saying, hey, thank you for your generosity in the past quarter. We were able to, with your generosity, our church was able to do X, Y, and Z of ministry, put tangible results on what giving. So people start to equate my giving equals ministry happening. That's one of the best ways I know that you can encourage generosity in your church. So giving is more important than ever right now. And like I said, we kind of talked about at the beginning, as we're analyzing things, people are responding. People are giving. And in many cases, churches are going in the right direction as far as giving goes. So, and like I said, I'll agree with you. In some cases, it's not an easy discussion to have. People are, unfortunately, a couple things that have become taboo is one of the things that become taboo in church sometimes, and we get worried to talk about giving. But remember, if people aren't reminded, they won't respond. We need to remind people that, just because we're not meeting in person, giving still needs to happen. We've made some areas available to you in order to do that. Maybe you have an online link that you can send out or give people there. Just remember, people need to continue to give during this time so that the church can continue to do ministry and be the leader that people are looking for in this crisis. So, future plans, as we kind of wind things down here, went right at a little bit over 35 minutes for that. So how do we prepare for the new future? Well, the points that I just gave out are some of the first ones to start with. What's next? Here's some action steps. Plan your budget for the next 3 to 6 months. Are we going to be that long? I don't know. I'll say I've been watching the news sound off, but from what I'm hearing, it sounds like the national conversation is turning a little bit optimistic. I don't know what that's going to look like. Maybe I'm an eternal optimist, but I'm seeing some things where it sounds like from a national level, they're starting to talk about what does this look like to open things back up. I'll avoid politics here and just kind of leave it at that. But plan that we might still need 3 to 6 months, even when things open back up. It may not be overnight that things respond and people respond. People might be hesitant to even still start coming back to church. We need to put some action steps in place to plan the budget for the next 3 to 6 months. Pastor, you may have to continue to do some version of what you're doing right now virtually in that plan going forward. So hang on one second here. Tim, we discussed last night what would happen if it turns into a recession after. Yeah, absolutely. There are going to be long-term impacts that are going to happen. I mean, the stimulus checks came out, the Payroll Protection Act, the EIDL grant that some businesses are open for. I don't know. I mean, no one really knows what that's. I think that's the discussion that's being had right now is how do we get back to any semblance of normal, which even if they open it up by the end of May or beginning of May, gosh, that would be great. I don't think things are back to any semblance of normal until Q4 at the earliest. What does that look like? We need to be planning what we're doing now, looking into fourth quarter, if not to the end of the year. I would start to prepare yourself for some worst case contingencies. I'm a planner. I plan all the way down, almost sometimes to the ridiculous. I may not put it all on paper. I may not tell anybody else about it, but I've got an idea what I will do in a lot of weird scenarios that may never happen. I can tell you my parents passed away when I was in my mid-20s. My dad had cancer, ended up succumbing to that. My mom died a year and 8 months later, unexpectedly. And, but unfortunately, because I'm weird like that, I had already kind of thought through my mind, what would it look like if my parents weren't here? And so when that time came, I kind of went into automatic mode and just kind of did my thing and got through it. So, that was a weird illustration to give, but plan for what could happen. Be ready for that so you're not blindsided by it. Now, are you going to go out and tell everybody and say, hey, we need to plan for it? No, but you need to have it in your mind, perhaps what could that look like for you and your church? I would be like I said, many of you are doing great at this, over communicate. This time we're in, I do it with my staff. We have worked remotely since we started the company in many ways, and now we're all working remotely. Even then, I've had to over communicate what's going on right now to my staff, even more so than I ever have before. And the more you can communicate, the more you can put the truth out, the more you can keep everybody on the same page, the better off we're all going to be moving forward down the road. So finally, focus on the positive and how you can establish a new norm. How do you want to come out with this as a church? I think for many churches, this is an opportunity to be something somewhat new as we come out. And I'm not saying you have to be new, but maybe there's some things that you were doing before that got old and needed to be revamped. What better time do we have than right now to revamp some ministries, to revamp some things that maybe weren't working in the past? Let's start talking about what that looks like moving forward. Here's some ideas to consider, okay? Lastly, a couple things I want to talk about before we open for some more questions. Set up and encourage online giving. If you don't have that already, you got to get that up yesterday. Many of you realize that we've brought on several new churches with our online give through Simplify Give over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We have had a ton of people respond there, and that's been awesome. When you're doing that, when you have online giving set up, remind people the simplicity of setting up recurring giving. We could debate all day long the theology of that offering time, the theology of actually bringing your first fruits to the storehouse. But the simplicity of recurring giving allows us to maintain and have some idea of what that can be. And most people are already automating most of their bills anyway. We might as well have that go into that discussion. The second piece I would offer you here is to take a look at our Optimize Your Budget course. I'm revamping it right now. We launched it last year as Building Your Budget course. After we've launched it and got some feedback, we realized that many of our churches don't need help building their budget. They want help taking what they've built and then optimizing it. So we're going to rebuild it and revamp it a little bit into more of an Optimizing Your Budget course. I will get in a lot more detail than we went over here in this webinar. There's a link there. If you just want to check the course out as it stands now, I'm hoping by the end of the month, we are going to have that revamped with all these optimizing, how to optimize, and looking at that not from an optimizing the crisis like we're talking about today, but just optimizing it for ministry as if this never happened. What does that look like to take your budget and actually use it for ministry? So, man, I appreciate your guys' time today. I'm glad, we had a great number of people register, and man, the attendance has been fantastic. So happy to see the percentage of people who registered versus actually showed up. So kudos to you. Thank you for that. Let's spend some time. I'm done with what I have to say for the day, but I want to offer some time to answer any specific questions you might have. What else? I would love some feedback too, guys. As you know, if you've ever done something and put yourself out there, it's always good to hear some feedback too. Was this helpful? Are there some things we missed? Would you have liked me to go into anything more detail? I would love some feedback on that as well. So, hey, thanks, Michael. Appreciate you being here as well. What questions do you guys have? We will stick around here for, I'm going to give you another 15 to 20 minutes if it takes that. If not, we'll shut down early. But what questions do you all have that we can talk about this? Hey, Tim, you're very welcome. Thanks for being here. Did we really cover things that detailed that there are no questions? I don't believe that. Grateful to look through this list and see lots of names that I recognize. So thank you guys for your support. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you spending some time in the afternoon. Where can we access the PP? Okay, yeah, Tina, absolutely. So that replay is available. We actually have a page on our website, simplifychurch.com/coronavirus. We put that all together there's a video on there. This replay will more than likely go into that same area as well. And we'll be sending it out. But the payroll protection program webinar is there. Tina, I'm going to tell you, if you're not already in the process of applying for that, I would do so ASAP. I know my bank here in St. Louis, I applied 2 weeks ago as soon as it opened up. I got my application in. As of last Monday, they had received 485 applications just here in the local St. Louis metro area. And I know banks across the country right now are overwhelmed with applications. So you're going to want to get in line very soon if that's something your church wants to take advantage of. So, hey, thanks, Natalie. Appreciate it. Richard, thank you. Grateful for you as well. Ryan here has asked, how much would you dip into your savings before you start to think about payroll cuts? Wow. That is a very good question. I think there's a lot to that. I would start to dip early on, very conservatively. If you are needing to do that, but you also need to analyze what are those payroll cuts going to cost you. Once you start talking about payroll cuts, you're talking about people, you're talking about livelihoods. I would say a discussion needs to be considered there of what is that person's role and how crucial is it to us at this time in ministry? Unfortunately, I hate even saying that, but we really need to look at that first. Do we need that person right now? If that answer is yes, and we're looking at things and we know things are going to rebound in the next 2 to 3 months, yeah, and we know we can support that out of our savings, then go there. If you have a person and their role is not as crucial to the church right now, I would hesitate to dip into payroll too far. Ryan, for you, if you have not already, I would take a look at the Payroll Protection Act if that is something that you're seeing your church needs. Again, like I told Tina earlier, the line is going to be long at this point. But you're on a waiting list. Great. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's kind of what I'm hearing. So, knowing that, maybe I would dip in a little bit sooner. I would use some payroll just to kind of get by. But again, I would really strongly take a look at what we're doing, who we have, what their role is on that, because I think that will help you to decide. Mike, right now for me personally, what am I doing with my company? I've got an amount of money in savings. I'm holding on to that as long as I can. Not because I need it right now. What I'm concerned about, what I'm keeping an eye on, is phase 2. What happens once we open back up if there's a double dip of the economic downturn? That's what I'm concerned. I'm not concerned about we're doing okay right now. What I'm keeping an eye on is the second round of what happens in the aftermath that we're not thinking, or how that things open back up, what that looks like. So, gosh, I know I rambled through that answer, but hopefully that gave you some insight there. Beth, thank you for offering this. I am recording what we're doing right now, and it will be available on demand. More than likely, I'm going to email it out to each of you, and then I will also probably put it on that Simplify Church /coronavirus webpage that we have some resources that we've been kind of updating there for sure. So, great couple of questions. What else can I answer for you guys? Hey, Danny, appreciate it. Hope things are well down the road in Nashville. And man, I hope that launch went good with the Oakville campus that you guys did just a couple weeks ago. I hope that the service went well doing it in that vicinity. That's awesome. So thank you for being here as well. Other questions, guys? I'm going to stick around. It's about 10 before the hour. I'll probably stay here for another 10 minutes at most, or at least if we need to, depending on how the questions come in. If I see there's still quite a few people hanging out here with me, and man, I appreciate that. So feel free to ask any question you have. Like I said, I want to provide as much info as I have for you. This is what I love doing. I love serving churches in this capacity, in this role, to where we can help you do ministry better. In some areas that maybe you weren't trained or not qualified, or just quite frankly don't want to do when it comes to the business side of church. So what else can I answer for you at this time? Jim, where is a good place to get Excel training? Man, don't take this to be too smug of an answer, but I'm going to tell you where. I don't know why we go to school anymore, because everything you want to learn is on YouTube. I would just hop into YouTube and start looking there. Now, if you start typing into Google Excel training, you're going to get tons of courses and things like that people are trying to sell you. Those might be a little more systematic if that's how you learn. But I would start with YouTube. You're going to find plenty on there for free that'll walk you through everything you need to know. And then as you get diving into it and you have more details or you have more questions, maybe you watch a video on YouTube and they bring up a concept and give you kind of the basics of it, and then you want more details, then I'd just go and Google that and dig in. I actually taught myself web development just from YouTube and online without buying any courses, without going to school for it. So there's a wealth of information out there for free if you just do not even a lot of digging, just a little digging to pick it up. So good question. Good question. Hey, Ryan, thank you. Thanks for being here. what else can I answer for you, man? This is good. I mean, I guess I went detailed enough that everybody got what they needed. So I trust this will help you guys, and that you will be able to optimize your budget. I'm going to stick around here for another couple minutes, just in case anybody has any final questions. There's 10 to 15 people left. So as soon as that starts to dwindle down, we'll go ahead and call it a day. But like I said, I appreciate those of you sticking around. Appreciate your time, giving me an hour of your day, and I'm happy to be here for you. So what final questions? Last call on that as we start to wind things down. Hey, Bill. Appreciate you being here. Have a great day. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point, just so that everybody doesn't have to watch us. Hey, Michael, blessings to you as well, man. Go ahead and stop the recording at this point, but I'll stick around for just a couple final minutes.